Late autumn, when the days became short and the nights long and cold, always brought heavy thoughts to Ivan. He was an ordinary office worker from a small town, returning home on the night train. That evening, the sky was covered with gray clouds, and the cold wind blew to the bone. Ivan settled in the almost empty carriage, enjoying the rare peace, when his attention was drawn to a lonely passenger sitting in the far corner. The man in the old-fashioned black suit, with his hat pulled low over his eyes, looked as if he had stepped out of another time. His face was hidden in shadow, and this gave off an inexplicable chill. Ivan tried to concentrate on the book, but again and again his gaze returned to this mysterious stranger. He did not move, only occasionally turning the pages of his book, but it seemed that each of his movements was accompanied by a lingering feeling of anxiety. As the train slowed and stopped at an abandoned station in the middle of the forest, Ivan saw the stranger rise and, without saying a word, head for the door. The street was dark and deserted. No lights, no people. The station looked as if it had been abandoned for a long time, but the stranger stepped out as if he knew the way. The doors closed and the train moved on, leaving him alone on the platform. This encounter left Ivan with an unpleasant feeling. A few days later, when he returned home from work, an envelope was waiting for him on the doorstep. Inside was an old yellowed photograph of that very station. In the picture, among the blurred shadows, Ivan made out a figure of a man resembling that very passenger. The feeling of anxiety intensified, and Ivan began to notice strange things. At night, he heard muffled footsteps behind the door, whispers that seemed to come from far away, and the feeling that someone was watching him. One night, the phone rang. Ivan picked it up, and the silence was broken by a barely audible whisper. "You left me." The voice was icy and empty, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. The sound made his blood run cold. The call was repeated several times throughout the night. Each time the voice became louder and more insistent, until it finally died away. Unable to cope with the growing fear, Ivan decided to find out what was going on. He dove into research, trying to learn more about the station where the stranger got off. In the archives of the local library, he found references to a mysterious tragedy that had occurred there decades ago. A passenger described in an old newspaper bore a striking resemblance to the stranger on the train. The article told of a man found dead on the tracks and how his identity was never established. Ivan decided to return to that station to try to understand this ominous coincidence. He went there at night, when darkness engulfs everything around. The station was abandoned, immersed in thick fog, and seemed like a place where time had stopped. Ivan walked along the deserted platform and stopped at the very spot where the stranger had gotten off the train. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the man appeared before him. His face was pale, with empty eyes like bottomless wells, looking straight at Ivan. The man stood motionless, and around him, muffled whispers began to be heard, growing louder. Suddenly, the shadows began to thicken, and all the sounds merged into a deafening roar. Ivan, seized by horror, fell to his knees, covering his ears with his hands, but the noise was unbearable. Gathering his last strength, he began to run, not looking where he was going. The forest surrounding the station seemed alive and ominous, with branches reaching out to him like hands. The run seemed endless, but at some point he came across a country road and ran out onto it, breaking free from the nightmarish captivity. When Ivan returned to the city, the world around him seemed different, as if the stranger in the black suit had brought something dark and sinister with him. Now Ivan lived in constant fear, feeling that this nightmare was not over. Sounds, whispers, and footsteps continued to haunt him, giving him no peace day or night. Friends and family began to avoid him, believing that he was going crazy. Ivan was increasingly alone, locked in his house, afraid to go outside. One day he disappeared, as without a trace as the stranger had appeared in his life. No one knew what had happened to him. Some claimed that on the night trains passing through that forest, one could sometimes see a figure in a black suit, standing alone on the platform, his gaze piercing the soul. People who saw him said that this gaze was impossible to forget, as was the feeling of inexplicable horror that it evoked.